when you get to be my age, you have a problem of short-term memory loss. I have to have my notes here. So I know everybody says this when they get up at the podium here about how important and inspiring this meeting has been. But I have to tell you the same thing. One of the problems that I have, and Jay alluded to the fact that I spend way too much time on airplanes. And every time that I get, 2 or 3 days from giving a talk that I agreed to do, I think, now why did I agree to do this? I don't want to get on another plane. I don't have time to do this. And then, of course, I come to the meeting and I have this inspiring time like I've had here where I meet not only some old friends who are here, but a lot of new people, and then all of these incredible ideas and the incredible work that you're all doing. So the next time I get a phone call, how in the hell am I going to say no? And my wife keeps telling me the word no is not in my vocabulary anymore. So it's probably just going to keep going. But I just want you to know how inspiring this time here in the last day and a half has been for me. And I also particularly enjoyed all of the presentations, but the one by Michael Sly this afternoon. And Michael, of course, is an all-time friend of mine. And to hear him talk about where his passion is at this point was also especially inspiring. And then Lonnie, I have never, ever heard anybody talk about being so successful with goats. And I remember, my father and my mother started farming in 1930 when they got married, and my father was a big advocate of as much diversity as possible. So we had almost every animal you could imagine on our farm. We had sheep, we had pigs, we had beef cattle, we had dairy cattle, we had everything from guinea hens to turkeys. And one day he went to an auction sale and he came back with a goat. And I thought, oh, we're going to get into goats now. And the next morning when he got up, the goat was on top of our Ford Model T, and that was the end of goats. So I never had the pleasure of experiencing goats, and it was just a real pleasure to hear you today. So this morning when Jay opened the event, he threw out a challenge, at least I took it as a challenge, and that is that you were going to leave here tonight hopeful. And I took that to mean, since I'm doing the wrap-up talk tonight, that I have some special responsibility for that. And I actually appreciated that, because I've been thinking a lot about what I want to say tonight, and I have followed this organization and its work, and know about many of the organizations that you're all a part of. And so as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about tonight, focusing on some of the hopefulness, because as we all know, there are an enormous amount of challenges, and I'll also talk about some of those for a reason that I'll mention in a minute. But I'm going to spend some time to talk about why we can and should all be hopeful. But I also want to share with you what I think hopefulness is about. And this is a lesson that I learned from Václav Havel, and probably you all have heard this story too, but I think the story is important enough that we can all share it even if we've heard it before. And when Václav Havel became president of Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia was in a mess and everybody knew it. And so somebody apparently came to him after he was elected president and said, so are you optimistic that you can change things and actually make something happen here? And he apparently responded, no, I'm not optimistic, because optimism doesn't help you. Because if you're optimistic, then you think, well, everything's going to work out eventually, and then you don't do anything, and that's the problem. And then he said, and I'm also not pessimistic, because pessimism is the same problem, because if you're a pessimist, you figure, well, it's all going to go to hell anyway, and there's nothing I can do about it, and then you don't do anything, and that's the problem. And then he said, what I am is hopeful. And hopefulness is doing the right thing even though you don't know that it's necessarily going to turn out well. And then if you have the right convergence of events and you're doing the right thing, then significant changes can take place. And of course, that's exactly what happened in Czechoslovakia during his time as president there. And I have kept that in mind in my own work, because as we all know here, and I've been involved in sustainable agriculture issues now for 40 years, and there's been a lot of times that there were reasons to be discouraged because we know all of the kinds of things that could happen, and often they don't happen, and you don't have that convergence of events. But then every once in a while you do, and then significant things take place. And so it's doing the right thing, even though you don't know the things that are turning around well, I think is the kind of concept of hopefulness that we should embrace. And Wendell Berry referred to this as difficult hope. And you know, I think it's part of what inspires me, at least, as I think about all of this. So what I want to do tonight is a couple of simple things. And is somebody got to keep track of time here and let me know when? Okay, great. Because you know, my watch is still on Central Time here, so I need to have a little bit of guidance here and when I'm getting close to the end. I think one of the other things that's important for us to keep in mind as we think about where we are here now, given, you know, not only all of the inspiring times that we've had here together, but the work that we're all involved in. And that is that, you know, important as all of the issues that we've talked about here and the important things that we're doing, you know, whether it's about trying to deal with the problem of pesticides or the problems of concentration or all of the other things that we talked about here. The important thing about that is, I think for me, that even all of those challenges, and important as this work is and has been, and the important things that we've all done, there is yet even a larger issue surrounding all of this that because sort of provides the context for everything that we're involved in, that I think is important for us also to acknowledge and embrace. And so I want to spend a little bit of time framing that issue, and then to talk more about what some of the kinds of things that are already happening that I think give us a ground for hopefulness as we leave here tonight. So the issue, it seems to me, that we often forget about, because we get so, and understandably, we get so engaged in doing the things that are now that need to be done. And you know, there was such a, you know, the work that you've all been doing, especially around pesticides, is such a great example of this, where, you know, you've got all of these important things about the impacts on our children, the impacts on our food, the impacts on all of us. And so, of course, we get engaged in this. We have to do something and correct this. But I think sometimes we forget about the fact that all of that is part of a much larger context that we're all engaged in. And that's going to make it difficult for us to ultimately get the kind of significant changes that have to take place if we're going to have a fruitful future, especially in our food and agriculture system. And that is what I like to call our cultural meme. Now, the term meme was created by Richard Dawkins, you know, who is, of course, did a lot about some of the wrong concepts from the point of view of epigenetics about the genome. But nevertheless, what he pointed out was that it isn't just our genetic makeup that, to a large extent, determines, you know, the kind of life that we're going to live, but it's also the cultural meme, which also, to a large extent, determines. And the reason for that is because we all live out of narratives, right? I mean, there is a sense that we have coming primarily out of our own personal history and our personal experience, which leads us to believe that certain kinds of things are the way things are. You know, there's within the scientific community, there's a common statement about, you know, that seeing is believing. Well, what many of our scientists are recognizing, who are starting to recognize this cultural meme, is that it's actually what we believe in that determines what we see. And so this is something we have to come to terms with. And you know, one of my favorite scientists who addressed with some of this is Michael Polanyi, who was a Hungarian scientist who spent a good bit of time here in the United States after the conflict between Russia and Hungary. And he became, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into, became very much engaged of what is science really all about and how do we do science. And one of the things that he determined was, based on his own experience, et cetera, and his work as a scientist, was that you never can establish objectivity, that objectivity is not a reality, because how do we know, was really the question he asked, how do we know what we know? And what he determined was that all of us operate of what he calls our tacit dimension. Our tacit dimension is the comes out of who we are, what we believe, and all of that is determined on our personal history, our personal experience, et cetera. All of that determines our tacit dimension. And there isn't any way that any of us can step outside of our own skin, so we're all caught inside of that. But then when we really want to know, when we want to exercise science and come to know what we want to know, then we all have to operate out of this tacit dimension and then focus on what it is that we want to know. And so it's this from-to relationship that's the exercise that we all get into. And then the way in which we have to test this is we become engaged with others who operate out of their tacit dimension, who are also going through this same process. And that's then where the community of scientists, what he called a society of explorers, we're all exploring together, right? We're all exploring individually out of our tacit dimension. And then we get together around the same table and we share how we see things and then we have to wrestle with that until we come to a consensus. And it's really the consensus that we come to that we then can call objectivity. But objectivity is really the wrong term for it, because once you reach this consensus, that isn't forever. Because the next thing that happens is somebody new comes to the table and with a different tacit dimension who asks a question or comes up with an observation that none of us around the table before thought about, and suddenly we got to look at the whole thing again. So science is not an accumulation of facts, it's a process. It's an ongoing process. And that's what, to me, is exciting about science, because it then means that that what we thought was true yesterday. And when I think about my own farm, what I thought was sustainable 35 years ago is absolutely not sustainable today. And if I were locked in ideologically because I knew I had objective truth back then and that was what I was going to do, well, the farm would not be successful today. Right? So that's kind of the journey that we're on. And then this cultural meme that we currently have created today is primarily determined, from my perspective, by our industrial economy. And the industrial economy really emerged as a result of our discovery of fossil fuels. I mean, that was the innovation which drove the industrial economy. First of all, coal and then oil and natural gas. And it was this cheap energy which made it possible for us to really reconceptualize the world. But it was also built on a prior notion, and that was coming out of the Enlightenment. We began to see ourselves as somehow being separate from nature, and that we not only had a right but a responsibility, as René Descartes put it, to become the masters and possessors of nature. And so we began to believe that we could control nature, that we could dominate it, that we could make it do what we wanted it to do. And we then saw ourselves as being somehow separate, not a part of what although Leopold then referred to as the land community or the biotic community. We saw ourselves as separate, and our responsibility was to dominate it. And so we saw ourselves as separate from nature, we somehow saw ourselves as being sort of isolated, and that therefore what we did in terms, and also our conscience was in terms of our fellow humans, right? We care for and take care of, to the extent that some of us at least want to do that, of fellow humans, but that doesn't extend to the rest of the biotic community, because the humans are somehow special, right? And then we also, and again, coming partly out of the Enlightenment and then going on into the industrial era, this whole notion that we have to, in order to really understand the truth about things, we have to reduce them to their simplest equation. And they reduce them to the simplest equation, then we understand what they're like, and then we make the assumption that that's the way the world works, right? So this then led us to develop these isolated disciplines, and all of you who have ever been to a university or connected with a university as I am now know that everybody operates out of their own disciplines, right? And if you want to solve a problem, you have to understand it and address it in terms of the science within that discipline. And there's almost no communication that goes on between the disciplines, and so isolated problems become sort of isolated problems, and the answers to those problems get answered in terms of what that discipline is designed to take a look at. And then we also, as a result of all of this simplification, we come to the conclusion that technology and science are the two things that are the most important things for us to learn. And arts and humanities, well, it's sort of fringe stuff, but it's really science and technology that determines how we should respond to problems in the world and solve them. And these are all part of these are not objective truths. These are part of the cultural meme that determines how our basic culture, what it operates out of. And then, and this is the more important one, is that we also operate out of a specific kind of economics in our industrial economy. The industrial economy operates on the basis of maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. And if you want to be successful, and it doesn't make any difference if you're a farmer or if you're manufacturing computers or you're manufacturing automobiles, that's the goal that you have to operate by, maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. Now, if you think about that, there isn't anything in that paradigm about resilience or sustainability or those things that we're all concerned about here. But we still are caught inside of an economy where we have to operate, or at least are expected to operate if we want to be successful in terms of that economic paradigm. And then, of course, how do you achieve maximum efficient production for short-term economic return? Well, you have to specialize, because that's how you get some of the efficiencies. You have to simplify your management, because that's the way you gain more efficiencies. And you go for economies of scale, because that's how you get maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. And so if you think it's a mystery why when you drive across any state in the United States now, you're met with these huge monocultures, that's the specialization. You're seeing technologies that try to simplify the problems so that they can be solved more simply. Transgenic technologies are a perfect example of that. If you've got Roundup-ready soybeans, then instead of having to have very complex systems that you have to involve in order to deal with your weed problems, you simply wait until the soybeans are up, and then you spray Roundup on it, and it kills all the weeds, and the soybeans are going to grow, and problem solved, right? And then, of course, the reason that our farms get larger and larger and larger now is that's about the economies of scale. As Michael reminded us this morning, we have been told, farmers have been told to get bigger, get out, and to farm fence row to fence row, and that's exactly what they've done. Now, of course, one of the unintended consequences, well, it's not only one, but it's a number of the unintended consequences from this kind of economic paradigm, is that when you have highly specialized, simplified, scaled-up systems, they become very brittle. And they become very dependent on a lot of outside inputs in order to sustain them. Now, as long as we had all the cheap energy and the cheap fertilizers and all those inputs, which sustained that system over the last basically 60 years or so, from a point of view of meeting the objective of maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. The economic return for farmers, incidentally, didn't work out that well, but the economic return to the system as a whole did. All you got to do is remember that 5 of the 10 richest people in the world now are 5 Walton siblings. So it's worked pretty well for them. But when you look again at the whole system and the health of the whole system and the resilience of the system, this is a very brittle system. And one of the problems that we have to address now as we think about the kinds of sustainability and resilient systems that we're about here in this room, we have to recognize that we are now reaching a point where this approach, this system operating by this cultural meme is not going to work anymore in the future. And this is where you can either look at this as really bad news and therefore not hopeful, or you can look at it as the trigger which is going to bring about the opportunity for the kind of changes that we're all talking about. And it's that second approach that led Thomas Berry, who's another hero of mine, referred to as moments of grace. That we're not likely to bring about the kind of changes to get the kind of resilience and the kind of purpose and the kind of ethical issues that we think we ought to be addressing until it gets to a point where the current system doesn't work anymore. And then the kind of changes that we need to see take place begin to take place. They're moments of grace. So in this one, it depends on how you look at it, whether it's a sign of hopefulness or whether it's a sign of despair. And there's probably a little bit of both of that in it as we go through this process. And as we all know, as we go through these process of changes that we're going to see, there are going to be some difficult times. And they'll be more difficult for some of us than for others of us. And then again, it's going to depend on how, as a global human community, we respond to this. If you think about the food crisis of 2007 and 2008, it's a perfect example of what some of the kinds of dynamics that are going to be a part of our future. Because the food crisis of 2007 and 2008 took place and then created a civil crisis and an economic crisis, simply because when you're living on $2 a day and food prices go up 20%, you've got a hell of a problem on your hands. When you're making the kind of income that many of us in this room are making, well, we can adapt to that and we can adjust to it. And then you start to get the kind of civic unrest. And if you want to read a very important book about some of the possibilities here for us as we move into this future and these kinds of transitions, which I'll talk about in a minute, Michael Clare published a book called The Race for What's Left. And he makes a very compelling case for, as these resources that we've gotten used to become more expensive and become depleted, that the one real likely possibility is that we as different nations and different cultures are going to get into these race wars to try to grab what's left. And therefore we could end up with a future of resource wars throughout the planet, which of course would be the worst possible outcome, because then we use up the remaining resources that we should be using to make the transition into our new future, and we use them up in trying to grab on for ourselves what's left. And then, of course, out of that, we would have a future of incredible civic unrest throughout the planet, and the 2008 crisis would only be, a small example of the kind of future that we would all be facing. So this is why it is so important for us now, I think, to begin to relate to each other, to anticipate some of these changes coming at us. And here's one of the other things that really transformed my life in the last 6 or 7 years. I always thought that my mission was to bring about change and to change people. And it hasn't worked out that well, but that's what I thought my mission was. And then somebody recommended to me Jared Diamond's books. And so I got a copy of Guns, Germs, and Steel and Collapse. And I discovered that here Jared Diamond, based on his investigations of past civilizations, made a very interesting discovery. And that was that those civilizations that anticipated the changes coming at them, not the ones that were trying to bring about change, but that anticipated the changes coming at them, recognized the value of their ecological capital, their ecological resources, and got a head start preparing for those changes, were the civilizations that tended to thrive. Those civilizations that failed in that exercise were the ones that tended to collapse. When I read that, I thought, I don't really need to bring about a lot of changes. What I need to do is prepare for the changes that are coming. Get a head start preparing for the changes that are coming. And that really, really refocused how I think about things and how I think about the future, and what ultimately makes me hopeful. Because when you anticipate the changes coming at you, then you can begin to look at what are the kinds of directions that we need to take, what are the kinds of relationships we need to develop, how do we get ready for that, and again, keep in mind recognizing the value of ecological resources, because ultimately, in our current cultural mean, this economy that we're involved in now, it's all about financial capital, right? It's how much money you get, how much consumption you can exercise in, how much stuff you can accumulate. That's what determines your value. But when you think about it, financial value has absolutely no value without ecological value, natural capital, and social capital. It's the social capital and the ecological capital that ultimately is the basis for financial capital. And so these are all the kinds of things that we need to be working on and thinking about now as we think about the future. Now, I want to, since this is primarily the focus of this conference is about pesticides, I want to put that into that context. And fortunately, I didn't have to create the literature for this because, and here's the interesting thing, we had an individual who was the head of pest management in the Agricultural Research Service. In other words, inside USDA. And I've heard a lot of negative comments about USDA, and I share most of them, and I've exercised some of them myself, expressed some of them myself. But here was an individual within USDA, and the Agricultural Research Service, who was a pest management specialist, who really wrote an essay, together with several of his colleagues, that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences back in 1997. And the title of his essay was A Total Systems Approach to Sustainable Pest Management. His name is Joe Lewis. And I still think that his, and it's a short essay, about 7 pages, I still think it's one of the most brilliant analyses of pesticide problems and how we need to deal with them of any that I've ever read anyway. And here was Joe Lewis and his colleagues, here was their position. He said that based on 50 years of experience now of trying to manage pests, using what he called a single tactic therapeutic intervention approach. In other words, you got a pest problem, you come in with a pesticide from outside and attack that pest to try to get rid of the pest. And he said, this single tactic therapeutic intervention approach is absolutely not sustainable. We know that now, he said, after 50 years of experience of using that method. And the reason it's not sustainable, because you never get rid of all of the target pests, you cause pest resistance. How many of us know about that now? And you not only kill off organisms of the target pest, you also kill off other biological organisms, many of which previously served as predators in the system. So you're actually creating the problem that you're trying to solve. And then he made an interesting observation. He said that we should not expect, and again, remember this was in 1997, so at the time when transgenic technologies were just evolving. He said we should not expect any different results from biotechnology than we did from chemical technology, because it's still the same paradigm. It's still a single tactic therapeutic intervention approach to solving the problem. And then he said what we need to do now is to shift to what he called natural systems management. So how do we come to the point where we understand how natural systems function and then manage those natural systems in a way that prevent pests from emerging? And he finally boiled it down to a simple question, which I always loved. He said, what we ought to do is we should, instead of asking, how do I get rid of the pest, what we should be asking is, why is the pest a pest? In other words, what a brilliant analysis. You know, why is the pest a pest? What are we doing that's causing pests to emerge? Now, when you look at that perspective and put it inside the context of a new cultural meme that we all need to develop and share, and this is what I want to make a sort of the heart and soul of my talk tonight. But the reason that the old cultural meme of maximum efficient production for short-term economic return, and the pest emergence, of course, comes as a result of that, because when you have specialized monocultures on a huge scale, you end up with brittle systems. You don't have the kind of diversity which are part of a natural systems management. So pests are really a part of the system that we've put together based on the cultural meme that we've subscribed to. So what Joe Lewis is telling us is that we got to go to a different kind of system for pest management, and I would want to say that we need to incorporate that inside of a different kind of cultural meme that has to drive the way in which we think about our world. And the reason that we need to do this is because of the kind of new challenges that we're now going to be facing. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to kind of frame it so that we understand why these changes are going to come. We're anticipating the changes that are coming. We know now that the fossil fuel system that drives our current, not only our current farming systems, but all of our current economy, is now of a very short period of time. We also know that many of the inputs that we're using are also on a very short period of time. We know that our fresh water resources are being depleted, so that's on a very short period of time. And then, of course, you add to that the whole issue of climate change and the impact which that has for a very short period of time. So I want to put this now into the frame of a historical context, and this adds to the great historical story that Lano told us about this afternoon. So here's where a PowerPoint would be useful, actually, but you all have good imagination, so this is pretty simple. I want you to imagine a timeline of human history across the screen, right? All the way across the screen, right? Okay. Now, there's an anthropologist, and I like anthropologists because they always try to look at how humans, evolved and how they behaved through the whole time that we've been on the planet. So Ernest Shusky wrote a book called Culture and Agriculture. It was published back in 1989. And as an anthropologist, the question he asked was, how have we fed ourselves as humans ever since we've been on the planet?
Organically.
Well, not quite. And the point that he made out was that we humans evolved on the planet about 200,000 years ago. Now, I don't know if all the ecologists or scientists are in agreement with that, but it's probably somewhere in that figure. So now imagine this timeline. So for the first 190,000 years that we've been on the planet, we fed ourselves as hunter-gatherers. We didn't produce food. We were not food producers. We were food collectors. So like other species, we tended to live in relatively small tribal societies. We would harvest out a place, and then we'd move on to another place. And he makes an interesting point. He said, from the point of view of energy efficiency, this was the most efficient food system we ever had. He calculated that we were getting about 20 kilocalories of food energy for every 1 kilocalorie of energy that we invested in making that food available. And this gave us a lot of, as he saw it, a lot of free time for other kinds of things, to enjoy ourselves, et cetera. Not to say that there weren't some challenges in that, but here's one of the other things that, we always kind of think that we became dominator species back when we were hunter-gatherers because we had to go out there, and Rianne Eisler has a wonderful book about this called The Chalice and the Blade, where she says that scientists in the past had come to that conclusion because we had to go out there with the blade, right, and harvest the food, and so we became dominators as a result of that. And then she points out that actually it was just the opposite, because when we were hunter-gatherers, we had to work together and cooperate together, and so it was more the chalice rather than the blade, which was the metaphor for our culture back then. And so we would go out and harvest, and if 2 or 3 of us went out from the tribe and we harvested an animal, we'd take it back and share it with everybody, right? Because you couldn't put it in the freezer. So it developed this kind of this cooperative, what she calls a partnership culture. And it wasn't until we started to go into the second phase. So now you go that 190,000 years. So you're going to go about 3/4 of the way across this timeline. And then comes the Neolithic revolution, right, when we start to do agriculture. And this was about 10 or 11,000 years ago. So now you've got a space on the timeline that's probably about 3 inches long for this 10,000-year period. And here now we do start to produce food. We do start to domesticate animals and domesticate plants. This, as he says, is a very land-intensive kind of agriculture, and this is why I disagree a little bit about whether it was organic. And basically, it was a slash and burn kind of agriculture, because you could go out there and you could cut down the grass or the trees that were there and burn them, and then you get the fertility from the ash plus the natural fertility of the soil, and then you could get pretty good yields from that for a year or two. And so then you went and you did slash and burn on another place, and then about 12 or 15 years later, you could come back to the original one and grow food there again. So that's basically how we did it. Now, from an energy efficiency perspective, it cut our energy efficiency in half. Now we were only getting about 10 kilocalories of food for every kilocalorie of energy we invested in making that food available, but still pretty efficient. And then he says that around the beginning of the 20th century, we entered into a third era of producing our food. And this is, and I always love this term, he called it the neocaloric era, because it's entirely based on old calories. And then he makes an important observation. He said, this era now again, think about 3/4 of the way across on the timeline, then about 2 or 3 inches timeline for the Neolithic period, and then the Neocaloric era, he argues, will be at most probably 150 to 200 years at most. Now remember that the first producing oil well in this country was in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, so that was about 150 years ago. So what do we got? Another 20 years, another 50 years, it's anybody's guess. But we do know is that the old calories we're using up, and they're not going to be there for us in the future. So we cannot simply concentrate on dealing with our current problems of pesticides, important as all these are. If that's all we do and we don't anticipate the changes coming at us and getting a head start preparing for those changes and recognizing the importance of our ecological capital, we're not going to be very happy about the future that we're going to embrace and become a part of. And that's what we have to add to the plate of our agenda as we think about the future now. Now, when you look at things that way, what we're really talking about is redesigning the food system, not just greening it up. I'm sorry, I haven't been watching. What have we got? 10 minutes? Okay, we're in good shape. As you think now about this transformation moving into the future under a different kind of cultural meme, and the new kind of cultural meme has actually, and this is where we do have a lot of help from the past, because we've had some wisdom from the past. When we first started to develop the industrial kind of approach, which Sir Robert Howard called the NPK mentality, and he already understood back then that the NPK mentality was not a direction we should be going in, because he in fact referred to that as a form of banditry. It was a form of banditry because we were going to ignore restoring the biological health of our soil, because we're going to be using all of these NPK synthetic inputs as a substitute for soil, and then our future generations would be robbed of the healthy soil which they were going to need, right? And then you had Liberty Hyde Bailey came along, who was one of the first deans of College of Agriculture when the land-grant universities evolved. And he used a concept which he called the new hold. He also understood that this industrial approach to agriculture was not, he didn't use the term sustainable, it was not possible for this to be a permanent agriculture. And so we had to get a new hold. And the new hold was to recognize that we have to understand and appreciate all of the gifts of nature, and to recognize even their sacredness. So the title of one of his books was The Holy Earth. Right? This was a different kind of culture that he was trying to cultivate, as did Sir Albert Howard was, we have to farm in nature's image. Liberty Hyde Bailey would have to get this new hold. It's almost like a spiritual kind of an approach and relationship with nature that we have to have. And then, of course, on the heels of that came Aldo Leopold, and Jay already quoted one of my most important quotes, I think, from Leopold about developing an ecological conscience. And this is what we have to do now, that it's not enough any longer for us simply to care for our fellow humans. We have to care for all of the life in the biotic community, of which, as he said, we are simply plain members and citizens. We're not the dominators, we're not the culture, we're not the conquerors of the biotic community. We're simply plain members and citizens. So we have to find our place in that, because if it isn't all healthy, if it doesn't all have the capacity for self-renewal, as he put it, then none of it will, including us. And so this is the new consciousness that we have to develop. And then Leopold recognized that this wasn't going to happen simply because he was going to write about it. And it also wasn't going to happen with the free market, because there are too many components of the biotic community that have no immediate economic return, and therefore that's not going to develop it. And it's also not going to happen through regulation, because you can't put the kind of control system where you control everything so that it's operated correctly. And that's why we have to develop this ecological conscience. And then he realized that that also was a huge challenge. And as he said, he didn't think that religion and philosophy was going to help us much, because they hadn't even heard of it yet. He understood that there wasn't much that he could do simply as an individual make this happen. And so he finally concluded this had to become part of a social evolution. And that's actually what's happening to us right now. So let me give you a few examples of this social evolution that's taking place now. And this is where the more direct hopefulness comes in from what I wanted to share with you. So one of the things that's happening right now in our food and agriculture system, and is being embraced primarily by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and was mentioned a little bit earlier today. And there is, again, one individual within the NRCS who has taken this on as his personal passion. His name is Ray Archuleta. And Ray Archuleta has become a passionate promoter of cover crops. And he's now been working, he started this program called Soil Health and Sustainability. And he's now working with farmers, and not just organic farmers. Many of the farmers he's working with are conventional farmers. And he's being able to demonstrate to them, even if you're a monoculture corn soybean farmer, and if you use the right mixture of cover crops and use those cover crops mixed in with your corn soybean rotation over a period of 6 to 7 years, you can reduce your fertilizer and pesticide input by 70%, still maintain the same yields, and the biological health of your soil improves to such an extent that instead of soil only absorbing a ½ inch of rainwater an hour, which is what most of our soils on the planet do now, they begin to absorb over 8 inches of water an hour. Now think for a minute about the challenges. We've got increasing energy costs. We've got increasing costs of inputs like fertilizers and pesticides, et cetera. We've got depleting freshwater resources. We've got more unstable climates, more floods, and more droughts. Now, if you've got those changes which take place, in which you're reducing your pesticide and fertilizer inputs, even if you're not organic, by 70%, still maintaining your yields, and then improving the biological health of your soil, that it absorbs 8 inches of water instead of an inch of water, which means during heavy rains you're having less flooding because the water actually goes into the soil, and some of it actually back into the aquifers which we're draining, and part of the reason that we're losing our freshwater resources. And during drought periods, you've got more moisture stored in the soil, and then with your cover crops, you also have more biological activity and green manure, which provides all of the, I don't need to tell you all of the benefits of that. So this is one thing that's happening. And right now, even some of the big farmers in Iowa are starting to grow cover crops. Now, it's certainly not where I would like to see it at this point, but this is a transformation that started to take place only about a year and a half ago, okay? All right. Second thing that's happening is we are beginning to recognize the importance of biodiversity. It's one of the other things we have to restore. Matt Liebman, who is a weed ecologist at Iowa State University, has done 10 years of research now on a simple kind of project. He became convinced that you could reduce your pesticides dramatically, as well as other benefits, if you simply went to a 3-crop or a 4-crop rotation instead of a 2-crop rotation. So he's done 10 years of research now at the Marston Farm, the research farm at Iowa State University. And what he's discovered is that what he's done, one plot, he's been doing the corn soybean rotation, the 2-crop rotation with all of the synthetic inputs like any conventional farmer would do today. And then the second plot is a corn and soybean rotation with small grain and red clover, and so it's a 3-crop rotation, and a modest amount of livestock manure. And then a second plot, or third plot, where he has corn and beans, and then a small grain with alfalfa and a second year of alfalfa, so a 4-crop rotation. What he's demonstrated now after 10 years, if you have that 2-crop and 4-crop rotation with this simple change, adding some livestock manure, et cetera, that you can reduce your pesticide and fertilizer input by almost 90%. Your return to land and labor is actually slightly higher than the 2-crop rotation. So there we are. You know, the evidence is there of what we can do. Now, you ask an important question, and I've actually asked some farmers in Iowa this question. So you got all these benefits, so why wouldn't you do this? And what are they going to tell you? Hey, you know, I can't take the alfalfa to a local elevator and sell it. And of course, what they're pointing out is that they feel caught inside of a market system and a market infrastructure that pays them and demands that they raise more corn and more soybeans. And the alfalfa, you know, if you have drought years, then you can get pretty good prices for the alfalfa. If you don't, you may not even be able to sell it. And what are you going to do? And that drives the motivation of the farmers. And so one of the reasons that that story is so important to me is it's so often so easy for us to simply say, well, the farmers are doing all these wrong things and they should change and we got to get them to change. But we have to recognize that we all have to change. We got to change the market system. If we don't diversify the market system, then farmers are not very likely to diversify their farming systems. So it's a part of, we all got to become engaged in the process. Okay, a third kind of piece of good news is what we're discovering now is the benefits of perennialization. And there are a number of things about this, and I can't go into all of it, but we're doing some prairie strip research now through the Leopold Center where we're putting strips of perennial prairie into certain critical places within a typical corn-soybean rotation. And the kind of benefits that you get from that in terms of soil preservation, in terms of absorbing more moisture, all of that is really quite dramatic. But you also got now people like Yvette Perfecto with the University of Michigan, who together with her colleagues has written this book, Nature's Matrix, where they are working primarily with farmers in the global south now who have taken land where forests have been destroyed, are now reincorporating food crops, tree crops rather, for food crops. And the benefits from that are enormous. Both in terms, again, of restoring the biological health of soil, maintaining moisture, requiring less irrigation, and all of those benefits. And then you've got Wes Jackson, of course, who in the Land Institute has now done 30 years of research in terms of perennial cropping systems. And what he's demonstrated now, and when Wes first did this, biologists said you're crazy because plants are either going to invest in the root system or they're going to invest in seed. So if you're going to invest in roots with perennials, you're never going to get the yields. Well, Wes thought that biology was more complex than this, and so he kept with the research. And what he's demonstrated now is that you, in fact, can have good yields. And the yields of their perennial wheat now is almost at the point of it being comparable to annuals. But then you have root systems which go 18 feet into the ground instead of 18 inches like an annual. And then you get all of the benefits from that, which I don't need to go into detail with you on. So there are all these things taking place. There are a lot of other things. Let me just cite one other thing because you wouldn't expect this. John Deere, you would not expect to be big on the kinds of things I've just talked about, right? Because they're part of the conventional system, et cetera. But John Deere publishes a magazine every month called The Furrow. And in February of 2013, they devoted this whole issue of The Furrow to soil health. And all of the stories about farmers, some of them who are doing the cover crops, some are doing other systems, designed for soil health. And they felt it was important enough to publish this. And then the next issue right after that was entitled A Matter of Taste. So it's not about yield. There isn't a word about yield in here. It's all about the kind of quality that chefs and other people in our food system now, they want this kind of quality, and how plant breeders and farmers and chefs can work together to develop the kind of quality of food and health-producing qualities of food that people want. And I can tell you that there is another part of the good news. There's a whole new school of chefs who call themselves the farm-to-table chefs. And they are not focused on manipulating the food once they get it to get it the kind of taste. They spend all of their time finding the farmers who are using farming methods to restore the biological health of their soil, which then produces the kind of food products that enable them to simply prepare it in a way that allows those natural flavors to express themselves. And many of those chefs are featured in, again, this John Deere magazine. So there are a number of other things we could look at, but these are the kinds of things that are happening. Not for them. Now, the fact that John Deere's featuring them is great because every farmer who has a green piece of equipment gets one of these, and they read this, and that's I think they're going to pay some attention to this. But we have to all be working together, looking for these, what I call beacons. These are not models of the future, because if you have a model, you think that if a farmer in California is doing something really unique and amazing like this, then I can do it in North Dakota. And that's not the way nature functions. But they're beacons. They shine light on an alternative approach, which are inspiring and which we know work because they're actually doing it. And then I can find out from what a farmer is doing in California or Florida, and I can begin to think about, okay, how can I learn from that to shed light on my own farm in North Dakota and design an alternative system for that. So I think these are the kinds of things that we can look forward to now. And can I do one other quick thing? The other thing that I think is important here is the role of the arts in all of this, because we think we have to convince people to do things, et cetera, and it's the arts really that can help us to imagine a better world than the one that we have, and also help us to imagine in a very concrete way the kind of damage that we're doing to the current world. And I want to read to you just a very brief piece here written by Kathleen Dean Moore, who most of you here in Oregon, I assume, know because she's the head of the philosophy department here. And Kathleen told me once that when she entered the field of philosophy, she found that most of her colleagues in philosophy used such dense language that they sometimes couldn't even understand each other, let alone the general public. And she didn't want to be a part of that. So she decided to write stories to convey these theological or these philosophical concepts. And in her book called The Pine Island Paradox, at one point she writes a chapter about some of the difficulties about the damages of our environmental damage that we're doing. And then she imagines her granddaughter writing her a letter from 100 years in the future. And what would she say? And here's what she wrote. She imagines her granddaughter saying, "How could you not have known? What more evidence did you need that your lives, your comfortable lives, would do so much damage to ours? Did you think that you could wage war against nations without waging war against people and against the earth? Didn't you wonder what we would drink once you had poisoned the aquifers? Didn't you wonder what we would breathe once you had poisoned the air? Did you stop to ask how we would be safe in a world poisoned by war? Did you think that it all belonged to you, this beautiful earth? You who loved your children, did you think that we could live without clean air and healthy cities? You who loved the earth, did you think that we could live without birdsong and swaying trees? And if you knew, how could you not care? What could be more important to you than your children and their babies? How could a parent destroy what is life-giving and astonishing in her child's world? And if you knew and if you cared, how could you not act? What excuses did you make? And now, what would you have us do? Now, I think when we think about where we are in relationship to this kind of imaginative letter that one of our grandchildren might write to us in the future, that can have at least the possibility of encouraging us into even more action than all of us are doing now, and to create this kind of new cultural meme that we all need to operate out of, that will provide for us the context for the kind of action that we need to take and the kind of way in which we need to relate to all of those other living beings, those other plain members and citizens together with us in that biotic community, which has to become self-renewing if we're going to have a productive and positive future, given the new challenges that we're going to be facing with the end of cheap energy, the end of the depletion of fresh water, the end of many of the other inputs that we've been using, and the challenges of climate change. And the new report from the International Panel of Climate Change reminds us that we now only have about 15 years to get a cap on carbon and to bring down the amount of carbon in the atmosphere if we're going to be able to have the kind of productive life that Kathleen Dean Moore thinks that we can have. So that's my story for today.